now that we understand Matthew 15, we really have a problem, don't we? Or actually, I don't have a problem, but you really have a problem. Because Matthew 15, Yeshua is very clearly warning his disciples not to follow the man-made laws and traditions of the Pharisees. But in Matthew 23, he says they have Mosaic authority. The Pharisees sit in the seat of Moses. Whatsoever they command you to do, that observe and do. So what's going on here? Matthew 15 very clearly is contradicting Matthew 23, the way it reads in the English. Well, when I first began to research this question, my first thing that I did is I looked in the Greek, and I saw that the Greek says the exact same thing as the English. Didn't really help me. And at this point, I was pretty much out of ideas. And I went to a colleague of mine at the Hebrew University where I was studying, and he was a big expert in New Testament studies, and I said, can you point me in some direction here? Give me some kind of indication of how I should proceed to try and solve this problem. And he began to explain to me that according to some scholars, the New Testament wasn't written in Greek. It was actually written in Hebrew. I thought that was very interesting, and I said, Hebrew? Why would you think the New Testament was written in Hebrew? And he explained to me that in certain parts of the New Testament, you have something which are called Hebraisms. Hebraisms are Hebrew thought patterns which are literally translated over into Greek, and when you read them in Greek, they sound like broken Greek. They sound like they were translated by a foreigner. It doesn't make sense. And let me illustrate to you what a Hebraism is by bringing you an Anglicism or an Anglicism. In English, we have an expression, dead as a doornail. Now imagine if I translated the phrase dead as a doornail into Chinese, and the Chinaman would come along and read, dead as a doornail? How dead is a doornail? What is that? It doesn't mean anything in Chinese, at least as far as I know from Chinese, but it certainly doesn't mean anything in Hebrew. And that's what a Hebraism is, these expressions and thought patterns that are translated over into Greek, and they make no sense in Greek. And what that means is you can read certain parts of the New Testament and see that they're clearly translated from another language, from Hebrew. Well, I began to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, Acts, and Revelations in Greek, and I could see, yes, they're full of these Hebraisms. They sound like they were translated from Hebrew. And I wasn't really clear how this helped me, though, with Matthew 23. Okay, so let's say these books were written in Hebrew. Here's the standard grammar of New Testament Greek, Blaston de Brunner. This is the grammar used in every seminary in the world, the standard grammar of New Testament Greek. And there it says, many expressions which a Greek would not have used, such as dead as a doornail, many expressions which a Greek would not have used were bound to creep into a faithful written translation of a Semitic original. So it's universally recognized by scholars that certain parts of the New Testament were written in the Semitic language and then translated into Greek. And the debates that go on between scholars is which parts of the New Testament and how much, and what was that Semitic language? Was it Aramaic or was it Hebrew? That's something I'll touch upon a little bit at the end, the question of Aramaic. But it's universally recognized that certain parts of the New Testament were written in a foreign language and translated. And as I was studying this, I saw, okay, we have these Hebraisms, and I'm reading the New Testament in Greek, and I went back to my colleague at the university and I said, how did this help me? This is a very interesting homework assignment you gave me, but how did this help me? Ooh, how did that get in there? That's actually a picture of my dog, and I thought this would be a good place to insert some comic relief in the middle of this intensive linguistic discussion. But basically, that's the look I had on my face when I was, I'm like, how does this help me? And she really has nothing to do with the story other than that she's extremely beautiful. And I'm looking at him and I'm saying, okay, Matthew 23, what does this have to do with it being written in Hebrew? It doesn't help me. I don't have the Hebrew. And he said, oh, Nehemiah, I forgot to tell you the most important part. What's the most important he forgot to tell me? This most important part, that the Hebrew version of the Gospel of Matthew has actually survived down to modern times. And that's known today as Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew is named after a rabbi who lived in 14th century Spain named Shem Tov ibn Shaprut. And Shem Tov ibn Shaprut lived during the Spanish Inquisition at a time that was plagued by something called the Disputations. The Disputations were public debates that were forced upon the Jews by their Catholic oppressors, and the Jews were forced to defend their religion against the Catholic religion, and it was pretty much a no-win situation for the Jews. If the Jews lost these debates, they could be forcibly converted to Catholicism. If they won the debates, they would very often have to flee town, flee Spain, because they've now insulted the Catholic religion. Well, most Jews would agree that it's better to have to flee town than to be forcibly converted to Catholicism any day of the week and twice on Sunday. And Shem Tov ibn Shaprut sat down and said, okay, I want to win these debates, so I don't have to be a Catholic. And he sat down and he wrote a book called Even Bochan, which translates into English as the test stone, in which he systematically goes through the arguments that the Jews could use in these debates, And interestingly enough, one of his main arguments was to systematically go through the words of Yeshua and show how the Catholics don't actually follow what Yeshua said. For example, he points out in his book that Yeshua upheld the Sabbath, and he says, how come you Catholics don't keep the Sabbath? Yeshua upheld the Sabbath. At the end of his book, Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut says, if we Jews really want to win these debates, what we need to do is start reading the New Testament. And at the end of his book, he includes an appendix, which was the Gospel of Matthew, of course in Hebrew, because the whole book is in Hebrew. And because this was included as an appendix to the test stone, this became known as Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Now, Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew was known for centuries by Hebrew scholars. However, it was simply assumed that Shem Tov had translated his Matthew from Greek into Hebrew. That was just an assumption, and scholars never even bothered reading this book. They just assumed, because they assumed it was translated from Greek, and that it wasn't really important. In the 1980s, a series of linguistic studies were carried out, and they found that Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew actually has certain characteristics which make it sound like this book wasn't translated from Greek, but actually that it was written in Hebrew. And one of the main characteristics that you find in Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew are what are known as Hebrew word puns. A Hebrew word pun is when you take two similar sounding Hebrew words, use them with different meanings in the same passage, and that creates a beautiful poetical style and a flow to the passage. And every ancient document written in Hebrew has these Hebrew word puns. The question is, though, what are they doing in a book that's supposedly translated from Greek? Well, first let's look at some examples of Hebrew word puns. The Tanakh, the Old Testament, is full of Hebrew word puns. Literally every page of the Tanakh has Hebrew word puns. For example, in chapter 2, it says, the first man was called Adam, Adam, and it says he was taken from the ground, Adamah. Adam, Adamah, man, ground. That's a classic Hebrew word pun. Two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. When you read it in Hebrew, it flows and it's beautiful, and it makes perfect sense. Another Hebrew word pun appears at the end of Genesis 2. It says, the man and his wife were naked. Naked in Hebrew is arumim. In the very next verse it says, the snake was clever. Clever in Hebrew is arum. Arumim, arum. Two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now in these last two examples, the Hebrew word pun really is just brought in to beautify the text, to make it flow and sound poetic. Sometimes, though, the Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual message of Scripture. For example, in Jeremiah chapter 1, we read, and the word of Yehovah came to me, saying, what do you see, Jeremiah? And I said, I see an almond branch. And Yehovah said to me, you have seen well, for I am diligent to do my word. Now, when you read this in English, it makes absolutely no sense. What is the almond branch doing there? It's like a red herring. What is that almond branch doing in the prophecy? What does it have to do with diligence? Well, in Hebrew, it's immediately obvious, because almond is shaked, and diligent is shoked. Shaked, shoked, two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Well, of course, Genesis and Jeremiah have Hebrew word puns. They were written in Hebrew. But what they found is that Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew also has Hebrew word puns. For example, and we're just going to bring a few examples, but there are many, many examples. Matthew chapter 9, verse 8, and the crowd saw and they feared very much. Now, when you read this in English, you say, okay, what's the word pun? But in Hebrew, it's immediately obvious. And they saw as vayiru, and they feared as vayiru. Two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. This is a classic Hebrew word pun. But what is this doing in a book that was supposed to be translated from Greek? It shouldn't be there, should it? Here's another one. Hebrew Matthew 12, verse 13. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand, and he stretched out his hand. And it was after this that Yeshua knew and he turned. Okay, again, in English, what's the word pun? You don't see anything. In Hebrew, it's immediately obvious. Vayet, and he stretched. Vayet, and he turned. It's two similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. A classic Hebrew word pun. What is this doing in a book that was supposed to be translated from Greek, though? You would only have these Hebrew word puns if this was written in Hebrew. Here's another example, which is very interesting. Here in Hebrew Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 to 35, we have the parable of the debt. This is the famous parable which talks about a king who's owed a debt by his servant, and that servant can't pay, so he goes down the food chain and oppresses his own servant. And 5 times in the parable it talks about paying. It says to pay 5 times. Pay, 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 pay. The Hebrew word for pay is shalem. So 5 times in the Hebrew it says shalem. Shalem, 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 shalem. Let's all learn that Hebrew word. What's the Hebrew word? Shalem. So 5 times it says to shalem, to pay. Then in the moral of the parable appears in verse 35, and there it says, there Yeshua says, so shall my Father in heaven do if you do not forgive each man his brother with a complete heart. And the Hebrew word for complete is shalem. Now, this is a classic Hebrew word pun that, just like in the example of Jeremiah, is intricately interwoven into the actual message of the parable. And without recognizing this Hebrew word pun, you're missing something. It's like that almond branch. You don't understand the connection there. In Hebrew, you immediately see the connection. He says it 5 times, and the 6th time it has a different meaning. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, it's very clear that this parable must have been spoken in Hebrew, because this Hebrew word pun is intricately interwoven into the actual parable. So if this was translated from Greek, that would be an impossible coincidence. And you have many Hebrew word puns like this in Shamtel's Hebrew Matthew. We only looked at a few examples. Here's a word pun that actually appears in Greek Matthew. Greek Matthew 16:18. Yeshua says to Shimon, to Peter, he says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And this is a Greek word pun that appears in the Greek Gospel of Matthew. And based on this verse, many scholars have argued that this is definitive proof that Matthew wrote the Gospel actually in Greek. Matthew didn't write in Hebrew. He must have written in Greek because there's a word pun in the actual Greek text. Now, we've already seen 3 word puns in the Hebrew, and that's just a very small sampling. There's only 1 word pun in the entire Greek text. Now, let's look at the Hebrew and see what it says there. In Hebrew, Matthew 16:18, it says, "You are a stone, and I will build my house of prayer upon you." Now, if you read this in Hebrew, you immediately see there's a word pun in the Hebrew. Because stone is even, I will build is evneh. Even, evneh, stone, I will build. That's a classic Hebrew word pun, 2 similar sounding Hebrew words with different meanings. Classic Hebrew word pun. Now, if this verse was a definitive proof that Matthew wrote the gospel in Greek, well, the very same verse has a word pun in Hebrew. So that proof falls away. Now, when I first learned of this, I thought, this is incredible. How could this be that the Gospel of Matthew was written in Hebrew? That's ridiculous. Okay, you bring me these linguistic arguments, but you can't just show up after 2,000 years and tell me the book was written in Hebrew. You have to have some kind of earlier evidence for this, earlier than Shem Tov Ibn Shaprut. And my first question was really, okay, the New Testament is preserved from the 3rd century and onwards in 5,000 manuscripts. And every one of those 5,000 manuscripts is in what language? It's in Greek. So how could Matthew have been written in Hebrew if there are 5,000 Greek manuscripts? And my next question was, okay, those manuscripts are maybe from a few hundred years after Matthew wrote the gospel. Maybe in the earlier period, there would be some type of testimony that would have to prove that it was written in Hebrew, maybe from one of the church fathers. And I said, okay, if Matthew was really written in Hebrew, how come none of the church fathers tell us that? And when I actually investigated and found out that they do tell us that. They tell us that as a fact. Papias was one of the early church fathers who lived from 60 to 130 of the Common Era, and he's referred to as a disciple of a man named John the Presbyter, who you know as the author of the Gospel of John. And Papias, with his inside information, he says matter-of-factly, in the beginning of the 2nd century, less than 100 years after Yeshua's ministry, he says, Matthew collected the words in the Hebrew language. He states this as a fact, a universally known and recognized fact, that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language. And he goes on and he says, and each translated them as best he could. That's very interesting, that second half, because what he's reflecting here is a recognition that it was a very difficult thing to translate this gospel from Hebrew into other languages, and everybody did their best. They might not have always been very successful, but they did the best they could to translate these things into other languages from the Hebrew. Well, let's look at some of these manuscripts of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. This is a manuscript from St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg manuscript. And Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew actually was published in 1987 based on the 9 manuscripts that were available at the time. This manuscript from St. Petersburg was at that time behind the Iron Curtain, and the Soviets wouldn't let anyone look at it. And it wasn't used when Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew was published. And because of that, the present publication, based on the 9 manuscripts, is really an incomplete picture of what's contained within this document, because it wasn't based on all of the manuscript evidence. And this is really a fascinating manuscript, because this is the first time this manuscript is being seen in the Western world. The first time this manuscript is being shown here. This is an unpublished manuscript, and who knows what's contained in these pages. Now, when I went to look at this manuscript in Jerusalem, actually this is in St. Petersburg in the former Soviet Union, in the city that was previously known as Leningrad. And with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, a delegation of Israeli scholars went over to St. Petersburg, and they began to microfilm all the Hebrew manuscripts they could get their hands on, literally to photograph every single page. And when I went to St. Petersburg, or when I went to look at the St. Petersburg manuscript in Jerusalem, I took it out, and when I brought it back to the librarian at Israel's National Library, he said to me a very interesting thing. He said, Nehemiah, was there anything interesting in that manuscript? And I thought that was a very strange question. I'd looked at many manuscripts. I've never had the librarian ask me if there's anything interesting there. That's just not his job. And I said, why are you asking me that question? And he said, because no one has ever checked out that manuscript to look at it before. This has been sitting in Israel for the last more than 10 years, and no one had looked at this manuscript, no one had studied it, quite simply because there are thousands of these Hebrew manuscripts that have been uncovered from the former Soviet Union, and it will take generations and generations of Hebrew scholars to study all these manuscripts and decipher them, and no one's gotten around to this one. It's simply, you can imagine that Hebrew manuscripts of New Testament books are not very high on the agenda of some Israeli scholars. So who knows what's contained within the pages of this manuscript? No one knows. Well, I know, but really no one knows because no one studied it. And what revelations of truth are waiting to be revealed by studying this document. Here's another unpublished manuscript, which is the Breslov manuscript. This is also originated in a city in Eastern Europe in the former Soviet Union. However, today this manuscript is not in Breslau. It's actually in Prague. And there's a very interesting story behind this unpublished manuscript as well. In the 1940s, the Nazis ransacked Europe looking for Jewish artifacts, Judaica articles of artwork and manuscript and Torah scrolls, anything they could get their hands on, and they brought them all to Prague, and they set them up in a museum which the Nazis called the Museum of the Extinct Race, because the goals of the Nazis was to make the Jews extinct. And actually to this very day, that's the largest collection of Judaica in the world, this former Museum of the Extinct Race. And who's extinct today and who isn't? That's a testimony, I think. We're still here. This is another manuscript. This manuscript actually is published. This is from the British Library. And the answer to our question of Matthew 23 can actually be found in this manuscript in the bottom 5 lines there, which is the section from Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 3. And when we read that in the Hebrew, we'll get a completely new understanding. Everything that we're seeing now, these contradictions. Matthew 15, don't obey the Pharisees. Matthew 23, do obey the Pharisees. Right now we're struggling with this contradiction. When we read it in the Hebrew, everything will fall into place and we'll have a much clearer understanding. Everything will make sense. Now, I want to give you some advice, because I know this is a very long session, but this is stuff that you won't learn anywhere else, and this is really foundational stuff. What we're presenting here today is the tip of the iceberg. You don't even know the iceberg exists yet. We're just establishing the foundation to, really these are foundational things. And here's the book that I wrote on this. It's called The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And as you may have guessed, the reason I've called it that is that the way Yeshua's words are presented in the Hebrew Gospel of Matthew is fundamentally different from the way they're portrayed in the Greek version. And that's why I call it The Hebrew Yeshua versus the Greek Jesus. And I highly recommend this book, because this is really foundational stuff. And there's a lot more that I'm not even going to be able to present here today. So really I recommend you get this book and read it a few times, give it to your friends and to your rabbis and your pastors, so they can also share on, especially your rabbis and pastors, so they can share on this very important topic, which really I lay some of the really foundations which in future years you'll see that amazing things are going to be revealed from this Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Now let me again give you a piece of advice, because this is a very long study and I've just completed the first half of the study. Michael's going to come up and say some very important words, so don't run away yet. But when Michael's done, we're going to have a short break, and then I'm going to come back and do the second half. Now the second half is really we're getting deep into this Hebrew Matthew, and it's really, in a way, the most important part. So my advice is, if you can only come to one half of this study, come to the second half. So in Matthew chapter 23, we've seen that Yeshua says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They have this Mosaic authority. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. And here it really sounds like Yeshua is saying very clearly, you must obey the Pharisees. They sit in the seat of Moses. You must obey whatever they command you to do if you're going to be obedient to what Yeshua says. Well, we've already seen this doesn't really make sense. Matthew 15, Yeshua warns his disciples not to do according to the ways of the Pharisees. Their traditions of the elders transgress the Torah. However, in Matthew 23, he's saying obey whatever they tell you to do. If they tell you to put your right shoe on first in the morning, you better obey them because they have Mosaic authority. What's going on here? Well, the answer is here in the Hebrew. And if you can read this old Hebrew script, and you already know the answer. This is what it looks like transcribed into modern Hebrew print. And what Yeshua says there in Hebrew Matthew chapter 23, verses 2 to 3, Yeshua says, Al kisei Moshe Yeshua pirushim v'chachamim, v'ata kol asher yomar lachem shimru v'asu, u'v'takanotehem u'ma'asehem al ta'asu, shehem omrim v'hem einam musim. So there you have it. There you see. It's very clear. This is what it would look like translated into English. There Yeshua says, the Pharisees and sages sit upon the seat of Moses, therefore all that he says to you, diligently do. But according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do, because they talk, but they do not do. Now that's a very subtle difference between what you saw in the Greek, a difference of one single word, or primarily one single word. In the Greek, it had said in Matthew, all that they say, you must obey all that they say, they being the Pharisees. In the Hebrew, he says you must obey all that he says, he being Moses. So the difference of this one single word fundamentally changes Yeshua's message. What he's saying now is, obey. If their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do as Moses says. Obey Moses. They claim their authority as they're sitting in this ornate stone chair in the synagogue, they're teaching with supposed authority, sitting in the seat of Moses, so obey Moses, do what Moses says. Now how did this happen? How do we change from they say to he says? Well, this is what it looks like in Hebrew, in the Hebrew manuscripts. And you can see it's very similar. It's almost identical. The difference between he says and they say is the difference of one single letter, the Hebrew letter Vav. This one single letter, the addition of this one single letter changed Yeshua's original message, which was an instruction to his disciples to obey Moses, to an instruction to his disciples to obey the Pharisees. So it changed his message from something that made perfect sense, their claim to authority is that they sit in the seat of Moses, so do what Moses says, to this message which contradicts his own words in Matthew 15, which is obey the Pharisees. He goes on there, Yeshua, in Hebrew Matthew, and he says, according to their reforms and their precedents, do not do. And the word I've translated here as reforms, in Hebrew is takanot. We've heard that word before, so let's all repeat that word. Takanot. So takanot are these man-made laws like the washing of the hands, and Yeshua's warning his disciples not to do according to their takanot. And I translated this before as enactments. A more precise dictionary definition of takanot is reforms that change biblical law. That's how the word is defined more precisely in the Jastrow Dictionary, which is a standard dictionary of early rabbinical Hebrew, late Second Temple Hebrew. Reforms that change biblical law. And the classic example of one of these man-made laws, these takanot, is the commandment to wash your hands of the rabbis before you eat bread. Well, now that we understand Matthew 23, and we see that Yeshua is not telling you to obey the Pharisees, he's telling you to obey Moses, we still have to go back at Matthew 15 and see what it says there in the Hebrew. If we started off with what was a contradiction in the Greek, we can't just look at the Hebrew of one passage and not the other. So now let's look at Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, and there we read, why do you also, Yeshua says to the Pharisees, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? You made the commandment of God of none effect by your tradition. Can anyone guess what the Hebrew word behind tradition is? The word is takanot. So not only is there no contradiction in the Hebrew between Matthew 15 and Matthew 23, but in the Hebrew there's a consistent message throughout the entire book. There's this consistent string that runs through the book that Yeshua is warning his disciples not to follow the takanot of the Pharisees, these man-made laws of the Pharisees. If we go on in Matthew 15 in the Hebrew, we read in verse 9, remember how in the Greek it said teaching for doctrines the commandments of men? And I mentioned that was a paraphrase of Isaiah 29:13, which says learn commandments of men. Others translate this, learn commandments of men learned by rote. In the Hebrew Matthew, there's the exact quote from Isaiah word for word. Learn commandments of men. Now that's very interesting. If Hebrew Matthew is supposedly this translation from Greek, wouldn't it have the Hebrew equivalent of teaching for doctrines the commandments of men rather than the exact precise words of Isaiah? That's a very, very interesting. Yeshua goes on. He warns against the takanot of the Pharisees. He also warns against their precedents, not to do their precedents. And the Hebrew word for precedents is ma'asim. Ma'asim is a word we'll look at in a moment. But these are two really important words, takanot and ma'asim, because these are the two things that if you're disciples of Yeshua, that he's warning you not to do, the takanot and ma'asim. So let's all say those words together. Takanot and ma'asim. All right, so what are these ma'asim? Ma'asim are precedents. The literal meaning is actions or deeds, and the Greek it translates this as ergon, which in your English you have works, the works of the Pharisees. But what are the works of the actions or deeds of the Pharisees? In Pharisee terminology, ma'asim refers to precedents or acts or deeds that serve as precedents. And what do they mean by that? Well, we've already seen that Pharisee law needs to legislate every aspect of life, literally from the moment you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to sleep at night. And what is, for example, the Pharisees command their disciples which shoe to put on first in the morning. So what does a Pharisee do when he comes to a new situation where the oral law doesn't tell him what to do? For example, if he lives in a country where you don't have shoelaces, and he doesn't know which shoe to put on first in the morning because he doesn't know which one to tie first because there are no laces. So what he does is he combs the oral law looking for instruction, and he combs tradition and man-made laws, and if he can't find any instruction on which shoe to put on first in the morning, if there are no laces, then he goes and he looks at the precedents of one of his rabbis. Meaning he looks and he says, we know that such and such a rabbi on such and such an occasion put on his right shoe first even though he didn't have laces, and that becomes a precedent. That then establishes what the proper norm, the proper standard of behavior is. The assumption is this rabbi could not be sinning, and if he put on his right shoe first, even though he didn't have laces, that's the proper standard for behavior. And what Yeshua is saying is, don't look to the precedents of the Pharisees as the proper standard of behavior. Don't do according to their precedents. Do as Moses says, not according to their takanot and their ma'asim.